king has been far too lenient with him. And that it's not just now this sex case.
The clip was only 30 seconds long.
No, I choose people who don't want to be written about, on the whole.
No context, no title card, no dramatic music. Just Tom Bower leaning back in his chair with the calmness of a man who knows the next sentence he speaks will ignite the entire country.
Whose lives are shrouded in mystery, and they want to hide their secret.
One raised eyebrow, a faint, knowing smirk, fingers folded like he was preparing to deliver a verdict. And then he said the line, the one that detonated across the internet like a flashbang.
Yes, it is a bad look, especially for Prince Andrew, because he has always denied having any sort of sexual contact with Epstein's girls.
People would be shocked to learn how closely certain royal figures were connected and who benefited. Nothing more. No names, no specifics, just a spark. But that spark hit dry grass.
That there are two truths. The first truth is that the conversation, I'm told and I believe, was very early on in their relationship when Harry is bowled over.
Within minutes, social media erupted. Hashtags spiraled into trending lists. Screenshots multiplied. Reaction videos flooded TikTok faster than anyone inside Windsor, Montecito, or any newsroom could prepare for. And in the center of the frenzy, two names were being thrown around like they had been welded together. Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew. Two figures whose reputations lived on opposite ends of the royal universe, suddenly dragged into the same storm. What did Bower mean? Why now? And what connection was he hinting at? Theories shot out in every direction. Some insisted he was teasing a hidden rivalry. Others swore he was about to expose buried palace politics, tangled timelines, or backstage tensions kept quiet for years. But the theory that spread fastest, the one that poured gasoline on the entire explosion, was the idea that Bower was hinting at a chapter of royal chaos involving both Meghan and Andrew, a chapter the palace had allegedly smothered beneath silence.
You know, Meghan I almost understood. She's a Hollywood B-list to be charitable actress. She was a social climber. Her whole thing is about image, so I can see why she's so easy to upset.
By dawn, the clip had been viewed millions of times. News outlets scrambled for angles. Podcasters prepared emergency uploads. Even late-night comedians in the US slipped jokes into monologues. But behind palace walls, there was no laughter. According to insiders, staffers snapped into immediate quiet crisis mode. Meetings, phone calls, dry-mouthed whispers of prepare for impact. Because in the royal world, when Tom Bower speaks, you don't wait to see if a bomb drops. You brace for where it lands. And then, just 2 hours after the first clip hit the internet, Bower made his next move. This time, it wasn't a teaser. It wasn't a hint. It was a line from his upcoming project. A single sentence dropped during a live broadcast. It is astonishing how events thought to be disconnected were in truth shaped by the same hand. That was all he said. One sentence. But it froze entire newsrooms mid-tweet. Who was the same hand? What events? Why release this now, when both Meghan and Andrew were already facing brutal scrutiny?
I do, and I think it has divided the nation and made us all, many of us, very unhappy on either side of the argument. I just found that Harry and Meghan, having said that they were setting up in California to spread wellness and love and sincerity, have done the exact opposite. They have done.
Commentators dissected every syllable like it was coded intelligence. Meghan's critics claimed the aim was obvious. Andrew's critics said the timing was too perfect. And online, where subtlety goes to die, people became convinced Bower was preparing to expose something seismic, something the palace had hoped would never surface, because Tom Bower doesn't tease lightly. And everyone knew a storm was building. The frenzy didn't just grow, it multiplied. Because within hours of Bower's second cryptic line hitting the airwaves, royal reporters began digging like miners chasing a vein of gold. Archive footage resurfaced, old interviews were clipped and reposted, rumors that once lived only in the shadows crawled into broad daylight. And through it all, one question thundered louder than the rest. What exactly had been shaped by the same hand? For Meghan's critics, the meaning felt unmistakable. They believed Bower was hinting at manipulation, careful narrative crafting, or behind-the-scenes influence she didn't want exposed. For Andrew's critics, the sentence carried a different weight, a suggestion that some of the palace's quietest tensions weren't coincidences at all.
Series dedicated to dissecting the most riveting royal scandals in history. This week, I'm joined by Tom Bower, author of Revenge, Meghan, Harry, and the War Between the Windsors, the defining book on Meghan Markle.
And while online speculation reached fever pitch, something far more telling happened behind closed doors: panic. Insiders claim Meghan's team went into full alert mode. Phones buzzed non-stop. Calls were made to consultants, researchers, and anyone who might have heard even a whisper of what Bauer planned to publish next. According to one PR source, the mood was frantic, not because of guilt, but because of unpredictability. "She hates not knowing the shape of the storm," the insider said. "Control is her oxygen." Meanwhile, the response from Prince Andrew's side was the opposite. Total silence. Staffers locked down communications. No briefings, no leaks, no whispers. And in the royal world, silence isn't calm. Silence is fear. By mid-afternoon, media organizations across the UK were cross-referencing timelines, comparing key events, and digging through years of royal reporting for any thread that could connect the two embattled figures. A few uncovered overlapping charity appearances. Others found ancient palace memos hinting at internal disputes. None of it was conclusive. None of it explained Bauer's ominous tone. Then came the first leak. A whistleblower from a production studio claimed Bauer's new material would shock both American and British audiences and reveal connections no one realized existed.
I think that would now not occur. I think there were various things about her sexual life which I dropped out on the grounds of privacy law.
It didn't matter that the leak didn't specify Meghan or Andrew by name. The internet filled in the rest. Headlines exploded across platforms, comment sections overflowed, and YouTubers, never ones to miss an opportunity, released hour-long breakdowns before dinner. Nearly 5,000 miles away in Montecito, the atmosphere had reportedly turned electric. Sources said Meghan paced the room as updates poured in, demanding answers no one could give. One insider described her frustration plainly. "She feels targeted. She feels hunted. She feels like Bauer won't stop until he burns her narrative to the ground." At Royal Lodge, staffers whispered their own fears. "Old wounds," one said, "are about to be ripped open again." Andrew's team knew the scrutiny would return the moment Bauer's project dropped, regardless of whether he had anything new to say. And then, when the world was already spiraling, Bauer struck again.
And in the Oprah Winfrey interviews and by Harry in the Apple interviews, can forgive him. I mean, he'd have to eat so much humble pie.
Late that evening, he released a short clip online. No dramatic music, no build-up, just him staring directly into the camera, leaning forward, and speaking with the quiet certainty of someone who knows millions are watching. "This is the chapter the palace hoped I would never write." The line tore through social media like a shockwave. News anchors cut into broadcasts. Commentators refreshed their feeds in disbelief. And in that instant, the question wasn't whether Meghan and Andrew were in the blast radius, it was how much of the blast would land on each of them, and how long the fallout would last. The moment Bauer's final line hit the internet, something shifted. Not online, that chaos was already in full swing, but inside the institutions that understood exactly what his words could trigger. Behind palace walls, a quiet strategic choreography unfolded. Meetings were called. Communications teams reviewed talking points. Senior advisors analyzed timing, context, and worst-case scenarios. No one dared say it out loud, but everyone felt it. Whatever Bauer was preparing to release wasn't just commentary. It was a pressure test on the monarchy itself. Because Bauer doesn't write gossip. He writes history that refuses to disappear. And that's what made both Meghan and Andrew's camps so uneasy.
Of their experience.
I understand. Well, because I sift it through. I don't put in stuff which isn't true and can't be checked. And also, I had some admiration for Meghan. She succeeded quite well in her life and her ambitions.
His claims weren't accusations. They weren't allegations. They were interpretations, reframings, the kind that forced the public to re-examine everything they thought they knew. And in the modern media world, reframing is sometimes more damaging than proof. Inside Montecito, sources described the atmosphere as radioactive. At first, silence, then panic, then the kind of frantic energy that only comes when a storm is heading straight for you. Meghan reportedly demanded to know how Bauer had obtained certain anecdotes, ones she believed were either private, protected, or deeply buried behind NDAs and legal barriers. Her team attempted to track down the smallest crumbs of information, terrified that Bauer's project would pull threads they couldn't control. Harry, insider said, wasn't angry, he was tired. He knew this couldn't be stopped, one source shared, but that didn't make watching it happen any easier. Across the Atlantic, Andrew's world wasn't any calmer. While Bauer wasn't hinting at new wrongdoing, even the slightest reframing of past events was enough to reopen wounds the palace had desperately tried to close. Staffers around him froze communication channels before journalists could even place calls. And though the media storm wasn't directly accusing him of anything new, the mere possibility of renewed public interest was enough to rattle his entire circle. Meanwhile, royal commentators were already dissecting Bauer's every syllable with forensic intensity. Live stream panels erupted on YouTube. Podcasts dedicated hours to decoding the meaning behind the same hand. Analysts who normally disagreed on everything found themselves unusually aligned. Tom Bower had tapped a nerve. As this hysteria swelled online, the palace adopted its oldest and most ruthless strategy: silence. No comment, no denial, no clarification. Just the cold, clinical detachment that had preserved the monarchy through scandals far older than Meghan and Andrew combined. But the scale of the digital wildfire made some insiders quietly question whether silence could still win in an age where narrative moves at the speed of a scroll. And beneath all the noise, something even more dangerous began happening. Resurfaced footage and old interviews started going viral again. Clips that had been forgotten for years were suddenly being reinterpreted through Bower's hints. Video editors stitched together timelines that were never timelines. Theories became narratives. Narratives became trending truths. But the most unsettling development was happening quietly behind palace walls. Advisors, senior advisors, were preparing for something bigger than a scandal. Something heavier. Something structural. Because if Bower really was writing a chapter, the palace hoped would stay buried. They knew this wasn't a wave. It was the early rumble of a tsunami. Public fascination didn't fade. It intensified. Because as the noise grew louder, something deeper began unfolding beneath the surface. Old clips, forgotten documentaries, stray interview comments, and moments from years past were suddenly being viewed through an entirely new lens. Royal Watch accounts stitched together elaborate timelines, podcasters recorded emergency episodes, comment sections morphed into full-scale investigation hubs. Even moments that once seemed harmless were now being reinterpreted as puzzle pieces in a much larger story. And through it all, the palace said nothing. That silence, that cold, deliberate silence, created a vacuum. And online, vacuums never stay empty for long. The absence of clarity became fuel. People filled the space with theories, predictions, and assumptions. Some fair, many not. A few bordering on outright fantasy. But it didn't matter. The narrative train had left the station, and it was barreling down the tracks with no brakes. Inside Montecito, the emotional temperature continued to rise. Insiders say Meghan alternated between fury and disbelief, convinced Tom Bower wasn't just analyzing history, he was targeting her. She reportedly told her team again and again that he had an obsession with her story, a fixation that she felt was personal, not professional. Her advisors, meanwhile, desperately tried to strategize. They debated statements, they debated silence, they debated whether responding would look strong or simply feed the fire. But the most troubling rumor came from someone close to her PR circle. Meghan was drafting a personal message, not an official press release, not a legal warning, a carefully crafted response meant to reclaim the narrative by painting Bower's work as biased, outdated, or rooted in hostility toward powerful women. It was bold, it was risky, and her team was split. Half believed it could flip the conversation, half believed it would ignite a second explosion. Across the ocean, Andrew's inner circle was battling a different kind of crisis. Not loud panic, quiet dread. They feared the simplest possibility, that even without new allegations, any renewed attention could undo years of carefully constructed distance from past scandals. Advisors at Royal Lodge reportedly moved with unusual urgency, tightening communications and bracing for headlines they couldn't predict. Meanwhile, Bower remained unshaken. In a follow-up appearance, he didn't tease new material or drop fresh hints. He simply stated, "My work speaks for itself. If certain people don't like the reflection they see, that's not my problem." The line ricocheted across TikTok within minutes, and the interpretation was immediate. Bower wasn't backing down. He wasn't clarifying. He wasn't softening his tone. If anything, he was challenging his critics to brace themselves. But the most unexpected twist wasn't coming from Meghan, Andrew, or Bower. It was coming from the public. Because the longer the frenzy lasted, the more people began digging into unrelated events, finding connections that had never existed, but now felt plausible simply because the atmosphere was so charged. Old clips resurfaced. Documentary snippets went viral. Influencers who had never covered royal stories suddenly jumped in, adding their voices to the storm. Interpretation turned into speculation. Speculation hardened into narrative. And once that happened, anyone caught in the crossfire, Meghan, Andrew, and even the palace, lost control over how the world interpreted their past. The monarchy may have chosen silence, but the internet chose noise. And the noise was only getting louder. As the online wildfire raged, the palace appeared motionless. But behind the curtain, something far more calculated was underway. Insiders described it as the tightening of ropes before a storm, a methodical preparation the monarchy had perfected over centuries. Senior advisors were brought into late-night meetings. Communications teams refreshed contingency plans. One source claimed even the most seasoned courtiers looked uneasy because they all understood one brutal truth: Bauer's commentary didn't need facts to create fallout. It only needed momentum. And momentum, at that point, was unstoppable. The real problem wasn't Bauer's word, it was the way the public was now stitching together a narrative of their own. A narrative blending royal history, media suspicion, and modern-day celebrity culture into a messy, sprawling theory that no one could fully control. Clips from the Oprah interview resurfaced. Old Andrew statements were pulled back into circulation. Analysts compared timelines side by side. Even irrelevant anecdotes were suddenly treated as clues. Interpretation had mutated into investigation, and every corner of the internet wanted to play detective. Inside the palace, however, there was a different kind of tension, not fear of exposure, but fear of perception. The monarchy thrives on distance, on the illusion of stillness, while the world churns. But Bauer's insinuations threatened that carefully maintained image by dragging internal royal dynamics back into the spotlight. One advisor reportedly described the situation with a single phrase: "We're being pulled into someone else's story." Meanwhile, Montecito was fighting its own war. Meghan's team debated strategies with the intensity of a rapid response unit. Should she respond? Should she stay silent? Should allies speak on her behalf? Every option had risks. Silence could be interpreted as guilt. Speaking out could amplify Bauer's claims. One insider whispered that Meghan felt boxed in, convinced that anything she did would be weaponized against her. Harry, sources said, grew increasingly withdrawn as he watched the storm intensify online. His frustration wasn't about the speculation, he'd lived through that for years. It was about the feeling of inevitability, the sense that he and Meghan were being dragged into yet another scandal cycle they didn't start. Across Royal Lodge, the mood had shifted from tense to dire. Andrew's team had no strategy, only fear. Not because Bauer had accused him of anything new, but because even a hint of his name being reattached to controversy was enough to reignite global scrutiny. A staffer reportedly muttered, "We've been trying to bury the past for years. Now it's clawing its way back." And in the midst of all this chaos, Bauer remained the eye of the storm, calm, unmoved, unbothered. Editors who spoke to him behind the scenes described him as serene, sipping tea and refusing to alter a single word of what he'd said. "He writes for the public record," one editor explained. "Not for royal approval, they have no power over him." That, perhaps more than anything, terrified both Meghan and Andrew's camps. The palace could silence tabloids, PR teams could pressure journalists, lawyers could threaten outlets, but Tom Bauer, he was untouchable. And he was just getting started, because the storm wasn't fading, it was gathering speed.